The rain came down in sheets so thick that Arthur Dowd could not see the guardrail until the tires were already sliding across it, and by the time his hands remembered the steering wheel, the SUV was turning sideways on Route 12, the whole hood tilting toward a ditch he had not known was there. Metal groaned, glass cracked. His forehead hit the wheel with a dull, deep sound, and then the world went quiet, and a voice in his own chest whispered, "So this is how it ends. Alone, on a back road, with nobody who even knows to look for me." Before we go any further into this story, take a second and tell me in the comments what part of the world you are listening from, and hit that subscribe button so you do not miss stories like this one. Arthur opened his eyes to a darkness he did not recognize. The dashboard lights had died. The engine had died. His left arm hung heavy and wrong against the door, and every breath scraped the inside of his ribs like a rusted saw. He tried to lift the phone from the passenger seat, but his fingers only found broken plastic on the floorboard, and he understood then, very slowly, that the phone had come apart in the crash, and that no call would be going out of that ditch tonight. He was 56 years old. He was the founder of Dowd Property Group, a company that owned more square footage in 3 counties than most people had ever walked. And he could not lift his own arm. He called out once, then twice. His voice was thinner than he expected. The rain answered, and the wind answered, and somewhere far off a cow lowed against the cold, but no human voice came back to him from the tree line. He tried to remember when he had last told anyone where he was going. He had not. He had left the office in Dallas at 4 in the afternoon, told his assistant he would drive down himself, told nobody at all that he planned to stop at the old family land outside Cedar Creek before turning back. That was the way he had done things for 30 years. Alone. Nobody in his ear, nobody in his passenger seat, and now nobody would know for hours that anything had gone wrong. Night dropped over the ditch like a heavy blanket. Cold crawled up through the floorboard. Arthur closed his eyes and tried to breathe shallow, tried to keep his ribs from screaming. And that was when he heard something moving in the wet grass at the edge of the road. Twigs snapped. Something heavy stepped closer. Arthur froze. He was too weak to reach for anything, too weak to defend himself against anything at all. And for one long second he thought, "This is the moment. This is where the story turns bad in the way stories on the news always turn bad." Then a face appeared at his open window. A dog, a big broad-chested, brindle-colored mixed breed with a torn left ear and quiet amber eyes. It stood in the rain and looked at him the way an old man looks at a friend he has not seen in years. Arthur tried to laugh, and the laugh came out as a wheeze. He told the dog to go. He told it there was nothing in that ditch worth catching a cold for. The dog sat down in the wet grass. It did not go. An hour passed. Arthur drifted in and out of the kind of half-sleep that cold and pain will pull a person into, and every time he came back to himself, the dog was still there, ears pricked, watching. His teeth had begun to chatter. His good hand had gone numb. And then the dog stood up, put its front paws on the doorframe, and hoisted itself in through the window with a grunt, dragging its wet body across his lap and settling with a careful heaviness against his right side, warm and still and breathing slowly against his ribs. Arthur, who had once told his daughter Laura on a Sunday afternoon that dogs were a waste of time and money, did not push it away. He had never been a man to say the word please out loud. He said it now, into the fur along the dog's neck, in a whisper only the dog could hear. "Please stay. Please do not go anywhere." The dog did not go anywhere, not for hours, not while the wind picked up along Route 12 and the temperature dropped 10 more degrees, not while Arthur's mind wandered back through 30 years of boardrooms and closings and quarterly reports and realized, with a slow and awful clarity, that he could not remember the last time another living thing had chosen to sit beside him for no reason at all. By the time the sky began to turn from black to a deep bruised grey, Arthur's breath had gone shallow and short, and his eyes were very heavy. He knew in a distant way that he was losing time. He knew he might not open his eyes again, and when he did open them one more time, the dog was gone. The cold rushed in, as if a door had been thrown open. Something fell inside his chest that had nothing to do with the broken ribs, something more like grief than pain. And Arthur understood in that moment that he had been holding on through the long dark hours, not to the steering wheel and not to hope, but to the animal that had chosen to lie against him. He tried to call out for it, and the sound that came from his throat was so small it did not reach the tree line. He closed his eyes. He was tired in a way he had never been tired before. And then, 20 minutes later, he heard boots on gravel. The man who came down the shoulder of Route 12 into the ditch was named Dennis Hollis, 41 years old, born and raised in Cedar Creek, employed by the Texas Department of Transportation for the past 13 years and driving a maintenance truck that morning to check the drainage along the county roads after the storm. Dennis would later tell the story like this. He had come around the bend just past the old cattle guard, and standing in the middle of the road, right on the double yellow, was the biggest brindle dog he had ever seen in his life. Ears back, head low, barking at his truck like it meant every syllable. Dennis had almost driven around it. He had almost tapped the horn and told it to move. Something in the way the dog turned its head and looked at the ditch had stopped him. He rolled down the window. The dog barked once more, then trotted a few feet toward the ditch, then stopped and looked back at him. Dennis was a practical man, not a man who believed in signs, but he was also a man who had grown up around dogs, and he knew when an animal was trying to say something it did not have the words for. He pulled the truck onto the shoulder and got out. That was when he saw the crumpled SUV nose down in the ditch and the pale hand hanging limp against the driver's side door. He got Arthur out, in the way you get any half-frozen man out of a wreck when help is still 40 minutes away, slowly, carefully, talking the whole time. Dennis wrapped him in a work coat that smelled like diesel and coffee, and he called it in on his radio. And while they waited on the ambulance, he asked Arthur what his name was and where he lived and whether there was anyone they needed to call. Arthur told him about Laura. Then he asked about the dog. Dennis looked around. The dog was gone. Arthur spent 9 days at Mercy Regional Hospital in Waco. Broken ribs, mild hypothermia, a fractured left wrist that required a small surgery, and a hairline crack along one cheekbone that made his whole face swell purple for the better part of a week. Laura flew in from Austin on the first morning. She sat beside his bed in the plastic chair the hospital gave to families, and she watched him sleep, and every time a nurse came in to take his vitals, she would ask in a small, careful voice whether he was really going to be all right. She was 30 years old. She worked at a non-profit that placed foster kids into adoptive homes, and she had not, in her entire adult life, seen her father lying still. Arthur woke on the second morning to find Laura holding his good hand and pretending she had not been crying. He asked her about the dog before he asked her about anything else. Laura blinked at him. She said the highway patrol had reported that animal control had picked up a large brindle mix walking along Route 12 later that morning. No chip, no collar, no owner on record. They had taken it to the county shelter 30 miles up the road. Arthur told her he wanted to leave. She told him he could not. He told her again. Laura, who had spent most of her life losing arguments to her father, looked at him then in a way she had not looked at him since her mother's funeral 11 years ago, and she said quietly, "Dad, you almost died in a ditch. You are going to lie in this bed and you are going to heal, and then we will talk about the dog." He waited 2 more days. On the 5th morning, when the nurses had gone to change shifts and Laura had stepped out for coffee, Arthur signed himself out against medical advice, walked slowly to the parking lot in a hospital tracksuit Laura had bought him, and paid a young driver from a ride app $140 to drive him 30 miles north to the county animal shelter. The woman at the front desk of the shelter was named Peggy. She was 62 years old and had worked at that shelter since the year Arthur founded his company. She looked up when Arthur walked in with his arm in a cast, his face still purple, his ribs bound under his shirt, and she said, "Honey, do you need me to call somebody for you?" Arthur told her he was looking for a dog, a brindle mix, torn left ear, amber eyes, big. She would have come in about a week ago from Route 12 outside Cedar Creek. Peggy's face changed. She looked down at her computer. She scrolled. She looked up again. And Arthur, who had spent 30 years reading the face of the person across a table from him, knew before she said a single word. She told him the dog had been claimed the day before. His stomach fell into the floor. He asked her by whom. Peggy hesitated. She said the person had not filled out the adoption paperwork properly, that it was more that the dog had gone with the man than that the man had adopted the dog. Arthur asked her very quietly whether she had a name. Peggy said the man had given a name, but she was not sure it was his real name. He was one of the men from the encampment down by the river. He came in every few weeks with cans of tuna for the cats. She had let him take the dog because the dog knew him. She said the dog had walked straight up to him at the front of the kennel and put its head against his hand. Arthur asked her where the encampment was. Peggy looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Sir, I do not know who you are, but if you are going down to that camp to make trouble for a good man, you will not be getting any help from me." Arthur told her he was not going to make trouble. He said the dog had saved his life. Peggy told him where the camp was. He got the ride-app driver to take him another 12 miles down a county road that turned to gravel and then to dirt, until the road ended in a wide clearing beside a shallow stretch of the Brazos, where a scatter of tents and one long faded blue tarp stood in the shade of the cottonwoods. Arthur told the driver to wait. He walked slowly, holding his ribs, into the clearing. A dozen faces looked up. A woman in a stained flannel shirt stood from a folding chair and put herself between Arthur and the tents. Her name, he would learn later, was Colleen. She asked him what he wanted. Arthur said he was looking for a man with a brindle dog. Colleen studied him. She saw the cast. She saw the swollen face. She saw the good coat. She said, "Mister, are you a cop or are you a lawyer?" Arthur told her he was neither. He said he was the man that dog had pulled out of a ditch. Colleen's face did not change, but something in her shoulders did. She turned and called out toward the blue tarp. A moment later, a man came around the side of it. He was maybe 60 years old. He was tall and lean and weathered in the way a fence post is weathered. He wore a Vietnam veteran's cap that had seen 30 years of Texas sun, and walking at his left knee, calm and quiet, was the dog. Arthur's throat closed up so hard he could not speak. The dog looked at him. The dog looked at him and did not move. The man in the cap said his name was Ray Whitaker. He said he was very sorry for whatever had happened to Arthur, but the dog had a name, and it was Boone, and he had known that dog for 2 years, and if Arthur had come to take Boone away, he could turn right back around and get in that little car and go. Arthur said he had not come to take anything. He said he only wanted to see the dog. He said he only wanted to say thank you. Ray studied him a long time. Then he told him to sit down before he fell down. They sat at a picnic table someone had dragged out of a burn pile 10 years ago, and Ray told him the story of Boone. He said the dog had come to the camp 2 winters back on his own, half-starved, with the torn ear and a wire cut across one hip that had healed by the time anybody saw him. Nobody at the camp knew where he had come from. Ray had shared his dinner with him the first night. The dog had stayed. Boone did not belong to any one person in that clearing, Ray said. He belonged to whoever needed him on a given day. He slept in a different tent every couple of weeks. He walked the perimeter at night. In 2 years, he had never bitten a soul. Then on the night of the storm, Boone had walked out of the camp for the first time in months, and he had not come back until 3 days later. And by then, Ray had already been down at the shelter every morning looking for him, because he had known, in that quiet way old dogs and old men come to know each other, that something had happened. Arthur asked him how the dog had ended up on Route 12 in the first place. Ray took off his cap and set it on the table. He said he did not know all of it, but he knew part. He said Boone had come to the camp 2 winters ago, but before that, the dog had belonged to a woman named Marlene Reyes. Marlene had lived with her teenage daughter Sophia in a little green rental house on Pecan Street, right on the outskirts of Cedar Creek, and she had rescued Boone as a puppy from a construction site off the interstate. Marlene had died in the summer 2 years ago. Cancer. Fast. The girl had gone to a cousin's place in San Antonio. The house on Pecan Street had gone back to the property company that owned it. And Boone, somewhere between the funeral and the eviction and the moving trucks, had slipped out a broken screen door and never been found. Arthur listened. He did not move. He asked Ray, very quietly, what the name of the property company had been. Ray looked at him. He said, "Mister, I do not remember. It was one of those big ones out of Dallas." Arthur closed his eyes. He knew without looking the answer. He sat at the picnic table with the brindle dog leaned against his good leg, and he understood, in a way he had spent 30 years never understanding anything, that the animal that had lain against his ribs through the coldest night of his life had once belonged to a woman whose house his own company had taken back after she died. He understood that the eviction notice had, in all likelihood, gone out under his own signature stamp. He understood that the broken screen door had happened because nobody at Dowd Property Group had bothered to check on the animal that lived at that address. He understood, sitting there in the shade of the cottonwoods, that the same corporate machine he had built with his own 2 hands had once thrown this dog into the same cold that had almost killed him. He asked Ray, very carefully, whether he could pay for the dog's food from now on. He said he would send money every month. He said he did not want to take the dog. He said the dog belonged where it belonged. Ray looked at him a long time. Then Ray said, "Mister, I do not know what you did before you got in that ditch, but you look like a man who is trying to pay for something that was not on his bill. If you want to help, do not send money. Come down here on Saturdays, sit with the dog, sit with us. Bring coffee if you want, but do not try to fix your ledger with a check." Arthur agreed. He did not know how to do what Ray had just asked him to do, but he agreed. He went back to Dallas that night. Laura had called his phone 42 times. When he walked into her apartment, she looked at him for a long minute, and then she started to cry, and she did not stop crying for almost 20 minutes. And Arthur, who had never in his life known what to do with a crying woman, sat down beside her on the couch and did not try to fix anything. He just sat. When Laura could speak, she asked him where he had been. He told her about the shelter. He told her about the camp. He told her about Ray and about Marlene Reyes and about the little greenhouse on Pecan Street. Laura went very quiet. She said, "Dad, do you know what house that is?" He said he had a bad feeling. She said, "Dad, we own that house. I mean, the company owns that house. It went into the last portfolio sale. I was working on the closing paperwork 6 months ago." Arthur closed his eyes. The next morning, he asked his assistant to pull the file. She brought it to him in a manila folder on the corner of his desk. The tenant of record on the property at Pecan Street from 4 years prior until the summer 2 years back had been Marlene Reyes, age 41, single mother, employed at the Cedar Creek Elementary School as a cafeteria manager. She had died on the 12th of July. The house had been repossessed for non-payment on the 14th of August. There were no notes in the file about any animal on the premises. Arthur held the file in his hand for a long time. Then, that afternoon, he asked his assistant to find him a girl. Sophia Reyes, roughly 17 or 18 years old now, last known address a cousin's home in San Antonio. His assistant looked up at him. She said, "Mr. Dowd, "Is everything all right?" Arthur said, "No, nothing is all right. But we are going to see what we can do about that." Finding Sophia took 8 days. She was not in San Antonio anymore. The cousin had moved. Nobody had a number. The private investigator Arthur hired eventually found her through a nursing assistant certification program in a community college outside Houston. She was living in a room she rented from a woman named Delphine for $180 a week. She worked 2 shifts. She was almost 19. She had not, according to the investigator, been able to keep her mother's ashes with her through all of it. They were in a storage unit outside Cedar Creek, along with 3 cardboard boxes of clothing and a wedding photograph. The storage unit was 2 months behind on payment. Arthur paid the storage unit that same afternoon. Then he asked his assistant to arrange a lunch with Sophia. He said he would drive down. He said he would drive down alone. He drove down that Saturday. Laura came with him this time because Laura had refused very firmly to let him drive 4 hours by himself again. They met Sophia at a diner off the interstate. She was very tall and very thin, and she wore scrubs from her shift and a small silver crucifix around her neck. She looked at Arthur for a long time before she sat down. She asked him in a careful voice why a man like him wanted to buy her lunch. Arthur told her the truth. He told her he had been driving through Cedar Creek. He told her he had gone off the road. He told her about the dog. And then he told her about the dog's name, and about the house on Pecan Street, and about who he was. Sophia set her fork down. She looked out the window. She did not speak for almost a full minute. Then she asked him, in a voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear, whether Boone was all right. Arthur told her Boone was all right. He told her Boone was with a good man. Sophia started to cry silently, the way people cry who have been practicing not crying for a very long time. Laura reached across the table and put her hand on Sophia's hand, and Arthur watched his daughter, who had never met this girl in her life, hold this girl's hand as if she had known her since she was a child, and he thought, "I do not deserve any of this. I do not deserve to be sitting at this table." He said as much out loud. Sophia looked up at him. Her eyes were red. She said, "Mister, my mother taught me that the words 'I am sorry' only matter when there is something behind them." Arthur nodded. He said, "I know." He said, "That is why I did not lead with that." He told her over the rest of that lunch 3 things. The first thing was that he was going to write her a check that afternoon that would cover her rent and her tuition through the completion of her certification and the first year of nursing school after that, and that no strings would be attached to it, and that if she wanted to tear the check up in his face, he would understand and would leave without arguing. The second thing was that the little green house on Pecan Street had been sitting empty since the summer 2 years back, because the company had planned to knock it down and put in a duplex on the lot, and that Arthur was going to stop that project that same week, and that the deed to the house was hers if she wanted it, free and clear, in her name, no mortgage attached. The third thing was that Arthur was going to spend the rest of his life trying to figure out how many other Marlenes he had signed off on without knowing their names, and that he had no illusion he could ever put back together what had been broken, but that if she would let him try, he would try. Sophia did not tear the check up. She did not speak for a long time. Then she looked at Laura, and Laura, who understood many things about people that her father was only beginning to learn, nodded very slightly, and Sophia took the check. She said, "One thing." She said, "If the house is going to be mine, then it is going to be a place where Boone can come whenever he wants to come." Arthur said, "Of course." They drove back to Dallas that night in silence. Laura fell asleep against the passenger window somewhere outside Waco. Arthur drove the last hour with one hand on the wheel and the other hand resting on the seat beside him, and he thought about the ditch, and about the warm weight against his ribs, and about how strange it was that a man could live to be 56 years old and only start understanding the size of his own life when he was almost taken out of it. But nothing is ever so simple, and a story that says only that a rich man learned to be kind would not be much of a story at all, because Arthur, in the days after he came back from Cedar Creek, began to change things at the company. He began to ask questions in board meetings that had never been asked. He asked about eviction rates. He asked about the age of the tenants they were pushing out. He asked how many of the properties in the last portfolio sale had been rented for more than 10 years. He asked whether the company had ever, in its 30-year history, waived a fee for a widow. His chief operating officer, a man named Brent Callahan, who had worked for Arthur for 11 years, sat across the boardroom table and watched Arthur ask those questions with a smile on his face that did not reach his eyes. Brent was 48 years old. He had a 2-story house in Highland Park, a wife who did not work, and 3 children in private school. He had, over the past 2 years, without ever telling Arthur, been in quiet conversations with a hedge fund out of Chicago that was interested in purchasing a controlling stake in Dowd Property Group. The conversations had been quiet because Arthur had never expressed the slightest interest in selling. But the terms had been generous, and Brent, if the sale went through, stood to walk away with a personal payout that would set his family up for 2 generations. Brent had been waiting patiently for the right moment. When Arthur had almost died in a ditch outside Cedar Creek, Brent had felt, for a brief and shameful second, the flicker of a thing he could not name. And when Arthur had come back to the office 2 weeks later and begun asking questions in the boardroom that made no sense from a shareholder value perspective, Brent had picked up the phone and called Chicago. The next board meeting was scheduled for the 3rd Thursday of the following month. Brent had, by then, already secured the private support of 3 of the 7 directors. He needed 1 more. Arthur, for his part, did not see any of it coming. He was busy on Saturdays. Every Saturday morning at 7, he drove down to the encampment on the Brazos with a large thermos of coffee and a bag of biscuits from the diner on the way in. Ray had told him early on that no one in the camp needed his money, and that if he showed up with a wallet in his hand he would not be welcome, but that coffee and biscuits, if he was willing to share them like a regular person, would go over just fine. So Arthur brought coffee and biscuits. He sat at the picnic table. He listened. He learned Colleen's name and Colleen's story. He learned about a man named Walter who had lost his job during the recession 15 years ago and never quite gotten back on his feet. He learned about a young woman named Rose who was there because she was hiding from a boyfriend who had put her in the hospital twice. He did not offer to fix any of them. He listened. Boone came and sat beside him every Saturday. He would rest his head against Arthur's knee, and Arthur would let his hand fall onto the dog's back. And he would keep talking to whoever he was talking to, and he would think, quietly, that this dog had chosen him twice now, and he was not sure he had earned it either time. Sometimes Sophia drove up from Houston on the weekends. She was moving her things, slowly, back into the little green house on Pecan Street. Arthur had, at her request, hired a contractor to repaint the interior and to fix the screen door that had been broken for 2 years. Sophia would come to the camp on Saturdays and sit with him and with Boone, and Boone would move back and forth between them, and Ray would watch it all with the quiet attention of a man who had seen a lot of things in his life and knew when he was seeing a good one. Then, on the 2nd Saturday of November, Sophia stopped coming. Arthur waited 2 Saturdays, and then he called her. She did not answer. He called her the next day. She did not answer. He called the nursing assistant program at the community college in Houston, and they told him she had withdrawn. He asked Laura to drive down to Cedar Creek with him. When they got to the house on Pecan Street, the lights were on. Sophia opened the door. She looked terrible. She had not been sleeping. He asked her what had happened. She hesitated. She looked at Laura. Laura took her hand and led her to the couch, and Sophia sat down and told them. She said 3 weeks earlier, a man in a suit had come to the door of the house on Pecan Street. He had introduced himself as an attorney for a firm out of Dallas. He had asked her very politely whether she was Sophia Reyes, and whether she was aware that the transfer of the house on Pecan Street from Dowd Property Group into her name was likely to be reversed within the next 90 days. Sophia had asked him what he was talking about. The attorney had told her, in a very polite voice, that Dowd Property Group was under investigation by its own board for improper transfers of company assets by its founder, and that the transfer of a residential property to her without board approval, without a formal purchase price, and without documentation of any pre-existing debt owed by the company to her family, was a transaction that a court would look at very carefully. He had told her not to sign anything else. He had told her not to spend any of the money Arthur had given her. He had told her that if she cooperated with the board's investigation, she would be treated fairly, and that if she did not, she might find herself named in a civil suit. Then he had left. Sophia had spent the next 3 weeks trying to figure out what to do. She had not called Arthur because she had not wanted to make things worse for him. She had withdrawn from her classes because she could not concentrate. She had not answered the phone because she did not know what to say. Arthur listened to all of this without moving. When she was finished, he said very quietly, "One name." He said, "Brent Callahan." Sophia looked at him. She said, "That was the client's name." "Yes." Laura, who had spent the last 20 minutes putting together in her own mind what was happening at her father's company, said, "Dad, this is not just about Sophia. He is coming for you." Arthur nodded. He did not say anything for a long time. He said, finally, "All right." That night, driving back to Dallas, Arthur told Laura the whole shape of what he was seeing. Brent had built a case. That Arthur, after his accident, had suffered a decline in judgment. Brent was going to walk into the next board meeting and argue that Arthur was giving away company assets, that Arthur was making emotional decisions, that Arthur was no longer fit to lead the company he had built. Brent was going to move for Arthur's removal as chief executive. And then Brent was going to complete a sale to Chicago that Arthur would have never approved of in 100 years. Laura asked him what he was going to do. Arthur said, "I do not know yet." The next day was a Wednesday. Arthur did 3 things. The first was that he called his personal attorney and asked him to pull every single deal Brent Callahan had signed off on in the last 5 years, every single portfolio sale, every single tenant eviction, every single property transfer. He said he wanted paperwork. He said he wanted all of it, and he said he wanted it fast. The second was that he called the ethics office of the Texas State Bar and asked in a hypothetical way what it would look like for an attorney to threaten a young woman with civil action for the purpose of intimidating a company founder off his own board. The third was that he called Ray Whitaker. Ray was not a man with a phone. Ray had, however, allowed Arthur to buy him one of those simple pay-as-you-go phones a few weeks back, on the condition that Arthur would never call it unless the sky was falling. Arthur called it now. He told Ray that he might need his help. He told him he could not explain over the phone. He asked Ray whether he would meet him at the little greenhouse on Pecan Street that weekend. Ray said he would. That weekend, at the house on Pecan Street, Arthur sat down at the kitchen table with Sophia, Laura, Ray, and Boone. He laid out what he wanted to do. He said the board meeting was in 3 weeks. He said Brent was going to make his move at that meeting. He said Brent was going to argue that Arthur had lost his judgment. He said the only way to stop Brent was to walk into that boardroom with something so heavy on Brent that no one at the table could ignore it. He said, over the last 5 years, Brent had personally signed off on a program of aggressive rent increases in properties held by an internal subsidiary of Dowd Property Group. That subsidiary had, on paper, been used to hold long-term rentals in 3 counties. In practice, it had been used to accelerate the eviction of long-term tenants, once market conditions made resale more attractive than continued rental. Arthur, until now, had not known the full scope of it. He had approved the strategic direction in broad terms. He had signed off on quarterly reports. He had never asked the questions he should have asked. The paperwork his lawyer was pulling would show that Brent had, in at least 14 documented cases, personally directed property managers to withhold necessary repairs from tenants who were behind on rent in order to accelerate voluntary departure. That was a violation of state landlord-tenant law. In at least 3 of those cases, elderly tenants had been affected. In one of them, a woman named Marlene Reyes had lost her home 2 weeks after her funeral. Arthur said, "I am the one who signed the company he built. I am the one who did not ask. I am not innocent in any of this, but Brent is the one who ran the machine. And Brent is not going to sell my company to Chicago while pretending to be the good guy." Ray listened. Sophia listened. Laura listened. Sophia said, "If you do this, what happens to the company?" Arthur said, "Honestly, I do not know. But whatever happens, I will make sure that what I promised you is protected before anything else." Sophia said, "That is not what I meant." Arthur looked at her. She said, "If you do this, the people who work at the company, the good people, what happens to them?" Arthur was quiet for a long moment. He said, "That is a very good question. And it is the question I should have been asking for 30 years. They talked for 2 more hours. In the end, they had a plan. Ray asked before he left that night whether Arthur was sure he wanted to do this. He said, "Most men in your shoes would take the easier road." He said, "You could quit. You could sell your shares. You could keep the house on Pecan Street and the money and the daughter and the dog. You could walk away." Arthur looked at Boone, asleep in the corner. He said, "I have walked away my whole life, Ray. That is why I ended up in that ditch alone." Ray nodded. He said, "All right then." The next 2 weeks were the most difficult of Arthur's professional life. His attorney assembled the paperwork. Laura, who had spent 5 years as an operations coordinator at her non-profit before it, helped organize the exhibits into a package that could be read in a single sitting. Arthur made a list of the 4 board members he trusted, and he flew to see each of them in person over the course of a week. He did not tell them what he was going to say. He only said, "Please be at the meeting on the 3rd Thursday, and please on that day listen with an open mind." He did not sleep well. He drove down to Cedar Creek on the Saturday between, and he sat at the picnic table with Ray and Colleen and Boone. And Ray did not ask him how things were going, and Arthur did not offer to say. They talked about the weather. They talked about a young man who had come into the camp the week before, 16 years old, kicked out by a stepfather. Ray was trying to figure out where to send him. Colleen thought her sister in Waco might take him in for a few weeks. Arthur listened. He said quietly, "Would it help if I made a call?" Ray looked at him. He said, "If you can make a call that does not turn into a story about you, then yes. If it does turn into a story about you, then no." Arthur said, "Understood." He made the call. The boy went to Colleen's sister the next day. It did not turn into a story. 2 days before the board meeting, something happened that Arthur had not planned for. Boone disappeared. Ray called him on the little pay-as-you-go phone at 6 in the morning. He said Boone had not come back to the camp the night before. He said Boone sometimes wandered for a night, but not 2, and never when a cold front was coming through. Ray said the Weather Service had put out a warning for temperatures in the low teens, starting at dusk that evening. He said if Boone was hurt somewhere, he would not last the night. Arthur cancelled his morning meetings. He got in his truck. He drove to Cedar Creek. He met Ray at the camp. They spent the whole day walking the tree lines and the creek beds and the empty lots along Route 12, calling for the dog. They walked past the ditch where Arthur had almost died. Arthur stood there for a moment and looked at the place where the SUV had come to rest. He walked around the edge of it. He called Boone's name into the wind. Nothing answered. By 4 in the afternoon, the temperature had already dropped 10 degrees. Sophia drove up from Houston. Laura drove down from Dallas. Colleen and Walter walked over from the camp. 6 people in 3 trucks fanned out across the county, and they searched until it was fully dark, and Boone did not come. Arthur sat in the driver's seat of his truck at 9 at night with the heater running, and Laura in the passenger seat. And he put his head against the steering wheel, and he did not cry, but he shook once, all the way through his shoulders. Laura put her hand on his arm and she said, "Dad, we are going to find him." Arthur said, "Laura, I do not know if we are." The board meeting was in 2 days. They searched again all the next day. Nothing. That night, Arthur sat with Ray at the camp under the blue tarp, and Ray heated up a pot of coffee over a small propane stove, and they did not speak for a long time. Ray said, "Finally, dogs know when to come home. When they can," Arthur said, "and when they cannot." Ray said, "Then they were doing the best they could with the life they had. That is all any of us do." Arthur nodded. He drove back to Dallas at midnight. The board meeting was in the morning. He walked into the boardroom at 9 sharp. Brent Callahan was already there, dressed in a grey suit that had cost more than most of Arthur's own suits, sitting at the far end of the long table with a laptop open in front of him. 3 directors sat on Brent's side of the table. 4 directors sat on Arthur's side. Arthur's attorney sat 1 seat down from Arthur, holding a leather folio he had been preparing for 2 weeks. Brent opened. Brent had prepared what he opened with. Brent spoke for about 18 minutes. He was, Arthur had to admit, very good. He did not attack Arthur's character. He praised Arthur's character. He praised Arthur's vision. He praised Arthur's leadership. He then, with the deep regret of a man who had once respected his mentor, laid out for the board what he described as a pattern of concerning decisions that had emerged in the 4 months since Arthur's accident. The unauthorized transfer of a residential property to a young woman with no clear connection to the company, the visits to a homeless encampment, the abrupt cancellation of a duplex development in Cedar Creek, the disruptive questions in board meetings that had begun to interfere with strategic planning, the medical records, which Brent had somehow obtained, indicating that Arthur had suffered a head injury, mild hypothermia, and had discharged himself against medical advice. Brent said, with heavy sadness, that he was not saying Arthur had lost his mind. He was saying Arthur had suffered a traumatic event and might benefit from a temporary period away from the responsibilities of the chief executive role. Brent proposed that the board immediately appoint an interim chief executive from within the current senior leadership to serve for a period of 1 year while Arthur focused on his recovery. Brent said he would be honored to serve in that role if the board so chose. 2 of the 3 directors on Brent's side nodded gently as he spoke. The third looked, for the first time, a little uncomfortable. Brent closed. Brent looked at Arthur. He said, "Arthur, I know this is not easy. I want you to know that everything I have said out of respect for you and for this company." Arthur was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up. He walked to the front of the room. He looked at each member of the board, and he said, "Thank you, Brent. Thank you for that. I would like to respond." He did not respond the way Brent expected. He did not defend himself. He said, "Everything Brent said about my accident is true. I did suffer a head injury. I did suffer mild hypothermia. I did discharge myself against medical advice. And I did, in the 4 months that followed, make a series of decisions that most business analysts would call outside the pattern of my prior 30 years of leadership at this company." He said, "What Brent has not told you is why." And then Arthur told them. He told them about the ditch. He told them about the dog. He told them about the woman named Marlene Reyes, who had died before her lease ran out, and about the daughter named Sophia, who had lost her home and her dog because a subsidiary of Dowd Property Group had accelerated the eviction of a dead woman 2 weeks after her funeral. He told them about the 14 other cases his attorney had pulled from the files in the last 2 weeks. He told them about the elderly tenants. He told them about the withheld repairs. He told them about the internal memo from Brent's own office, dated 3 years ago, that laid out, in plain English, a strategy for accelerating voluntary departure through the strategic denial of maintenance. He said, "I did not know, which is not an excuse. I signed off on a strategy in the abstract. I did not read the memos. I did not walk the properties. I did not ask questions. And a dog that once belonged to a woman we pushed out of her house saved my life in a ditch 4 months ago. And I have spent every day since asking myself how it is that I built a company that broke a home that raised the dog that saved me." He said, "I am not the man to run this company anymore. If the standard is the man Brent Callahan describes, that man is not coming back. But I am not going to walk out that door and hand my 30-year company to the man who wrote those memos." He turned to his attorney. His attorney passed a leather folio to each of the 7 directors. He said, "Inside those folios, you will find documentation, complete and dated and signed, of the internal practices I have just described. You will find the memos. You will find the property files. You will find the eviction records, and you will find a preliminary letter from a partner at a firm in Austin, retained by me personally, indicating that Dowd Property Group is likely to face substantial civil exposure if these practices are not fully and transparently addressed." He said, "I am proposing 3 things. The first is that Brent Callahan resign, effective immediately. The second is that this board authorize an independent investigation into every eviction executed by the company in the last 5 years, and that any tenant found to have been harmed by unlawful maintenance denial receive full compensation. The third is that this board authorize the establishment of a foundation funded by 10% of the company's annual profits going forward to provide emergency housing assistance to elderly and single-parent tenants facing loss of stable housing in the 3 counties where this company operates. That foundation will be named after Marlene Reyes." He said, "If you cannot support these 3 things, I will resign at the end of this meeting, and I will go public with everything in those folios within 30 days. The boardroom was very quiet. Brent's face had gone the color of old newspaper. He tried to speak. His voice came out uneven. He said, "Arthur, this is absurd. This is a hostage situation. This is not how a company is run." Arthur looked at him. He said, "Brent, no. This is a company being run for the first time in 30 years. The 3 directors on Brent's side of the table looked at the folios in front of them. The one who had already looked uncomfortable had begun to read. His face was changing. The other 2 exchanged a glance that could not be walked back. The 4 directors on Arthur's side had been briefed the night before. They were ready. The vote to accept Arthur's 3 proposals was 6-1. Brent voted no. The vote to accept Brent's resignation, effective immediately, was 6-1. Brent, at that point, had already stood up. He gathered his laptop. He did not look at Arthur. He did not look at anyone. He walked out of the room. Arthur sat back down. His hands were shaking. Laura, who had been sitting in the back of the room the entire time, walked up to him and put her hand on his shoulder. He said quietly into the empty middle of the table, "That was the hardest thing I have ever done." Laura said, "Dad." It was the right thing. Arthur said, "I know." Then he stood up. He said, "Will you drive me somewhere?" Laura said, "Of course." He said, "Drive me to Cedar Creek. I have to find the dog." They left. They drove down. The temperature had already begun to fall again. The weather service had a second cold front coming through, expected to bring the low teens for a 3rd night in a row. They got to the encampment just before dusk. Ray was standing at the edge of the road with his hands in his pockets. He looked up when Arthur got out of the truck. Arthur said, "Has he come back?" Ray said, "No." Arthur said, "We have to find him." Ray said, "We have looked, brother. We have looked." Arthur said, "We have not looked in the ditch." Ray blinked at him. Arthur said, "The ditch on Route 12, where he found me." "We have not been back there since yesterday morning." If he is going to be anywhere, if he is scared, if he is hurt, if his mind is going, that is where he would go. That is the last place he knew me. Ray looked at him for a long time. Then Ray said, "All right, get in the truck." They drove down Route 12 as the sun went down behind the cedar breaks. The wind was rising. Laura followed in her own car. Sophia, who had driven up from Houston that morning to meet Arthur at the office after the meeting, was in the passenger seat of Laura's car. They pulled up to the shoulder of the road. The ditch was empty. The grass had grown back. There was no sign of anything. Arthur got out. His breath came in white clouds. He called Boone's name. He walked along the edge of the ditch. He climbed down into it. He stood in the exact place where the SUV had come to rest, and he turned in a circle, and he called Boone's name again. Nothing answered. Arthur sat down on the wet grass. He was 56 years old. He was tired. He had just torn his own life open in a boardroom 200 miles away, and the dog he had come to find was not there, and the sky was turning the color of iron, and the cold was coming. Ray came down into the ditch beside him. Ray did not say anything. Ray sat down beside him. They sat there for maybe a minute, maybe two. Then, from up the tree line, they heard something. A shuffling, a slow, uneven step. Boone came out of the cedar brake. He was limping. His right hind leg was held up off the ground. His fur was matted and wet. His head was low. He looked at Arthur across the ditch, and Arthur, in that moment, did not remember standing up. But he was standing up, and he was walking, and Boone was walking toward him, and they met in the middle of the wet grass at the bottom of the ditch on Route 12. Arthur got down on one knee. He put his good hand under the dog's chin. He said, "Buddy, Buddy, where were you?" Boone leaned his whole weight into Arthur's chest. Ray was already unfolding his coat. Laura was already scrambling down the slope with a towel from the trunk of her car. Sophia was already on the phone with the veterinary clinic in Cedar Creek. Arthur, in the middle of all of it, held the dog against him and did not move. The vet in Cedar Creek was a woman named Dr. Patricia Ellis. She stayed 2 hours late for them. Boone had a puncture wound on his right hind leg that was probably from barbed wire, and he was dehydrated, and he had lost weight, and his paws were cut up from walking on hard ground. But he was going to be all right. She sent them home with antibiotics and painkillers and instructions to keep him warm and to keep him quiet for a week. They took him back to the little green house on Pecan Street. Sophia had, over the last month, moved almost everything in. The living room had her mother's old couch in it, and a rug on the floor, and a small kitchen table with 2 chairs. Sophia laid a blanket in front of the couch, and Boone curled up on it and closed his eyes, and Arthur sat on the couch beside him with his hand on the dog's back, and Laura made coffee in the kitchen, and Ray stood in the doorway with his cap in his hand, and Sophia sat on the floor beside the blanket. Nobody said anything for a long time. Ray said, finally, "Dogs know." Arthur looked at him. Ray said, "They know when to come home. They know when it is safe." Arthur nodded. He said quietly, "So did I." In the weeks that followed, things did not immediately become simple, because life is not that way. The investigation into the company's eviction practices began, and it was long, and it was expensive, and it found what Arthur had feared it would find. The foundation named after Marlene Reyes was established, and it was funded, and it began its work in the 3 counties. Brent Callahan hired a lawyer and made a public statement about how he had been forced out of the company for raising concerns about the founder's mental health. And it did not stick, because 6 directors and a folio full of memos said otherwise. The interim chief executive of Dowd Property Group was a woman named Elena Vargas, who had run the property management division for 8 years and who Arthur had 4 months earlier never even had lunch with. She was very good at her job. Arthur, who remained on the board but stepped down from day-to-day operations, sat back and watched her work and understood slowly that his company was in better hands than it had ever been. Sophia finished her nursing assistant certification in the spring. She started nursing school that fall at a program in Waco because Waco was close enough to Cedar Creek that she could keep the little green house on Pecan Street as her home. Boone lived at the house with her. He also lived on occasion at the encampment on the Brazos, and he also lived on occasion at Arthur's house in Dallas. Everybody understood that Boone belonged to no one and to everyone, and that any attempt to make him belong to just one person would have been a violation of the deep and quiet dignity that had always defined him. Ray continued to live at the camp. He did not want a house. He had told Arthur one afternoon at the picnic table that he had lived under a roof for the first 60 years of his life, and that he had never once slept as well under a roof as he slept under the blue tarp, and that he did not need Arthur or anybody else to fix his life for him. What he needed, he said, was for people to stop pretending he was invisible. Arthur understood. Laura moved back to Dallas that summer to be closer to her father. She kept her job at the non-profit, but she started to spend her Saturdays driving down to the encampment with Arthur, and she started to help Ray connect the people at the camp with services she knew how to work with. She was, Arthur came to understand, better at that kind of work than anybody he had ever met, and he wondered, with some regret, how long she had been doing this while he had been paying no attention. He asked her one evening whether she was happy. It was the first time in his life he had asked her that question. She thought about it for a while. Then she said, "Dad, I am happier than I have been in a long time, and I think you might be too." Arthur nodded. He said, "I think I might be." One evening, almost a year after the accident, Arthur drove down to Cedar Creek alone. He drove out along Route 12, past the encampment, past the little green house on Pecan Street, past the vet clinic, until he came to the exact stretch of road where the SUV had gone off the shoulder into the ditch. He pulled his truck onto the gravel. He got out. The ditch was almost dry now. The grass had grown back thick. Somebody had, at some point, put a small wooden cross into the ground about 10 feet up from where his car had come to rest, and Arthur did not know who or why, but he stood beside it for a while. Boone had come with him. Boone got out of the truck and stood beside him and rested his head against Arthur's leg, and Arthur, standing there in the last of the evening light, felt for the first time in a very long time that his own life fit inside his own body. He thought about the man he had been 1 year before, sitting alone in the wreck of a car with a broken arm and a broken phone and a chest that could not hold on to any breath. He thought about how, in that moment, he had believed that his life would end in a ditch, alone, with nobody who even knew to look for him. He was still standing on the same ditch. He was still 56 years old. He was still, in a lot of ways, the same man. But the dog beside him was warm, and the daughter in Dallas would call at 7 that night to ask him how his day had gone, and the young woman in the little green house on Pecan Street would send him a photo of her nursing school textbook that weekend, with a small note that said, "Thank you again," and the old man under the blue tarp on the Brazos would be waiting for him on Saturday with a pot of coffee. And 100 families across 3 counties who had almost lost their homes would be sleeping in their own beds tonight because a foundation named after Marlene Reyes had paid what they could not. He reached down and rested his hand on Boone's back. He said, quietly, into the wind, "We are going home now, buddy." Boone leaned into him. They walked back up to the truck together. Arthur opened the passenger door. Boone climbed in and settled on the seat with his head on the console, and Arthur got in on the driver's side and pulled onto Route 12, and the sun went down behind the cedar breaks, and the two of them drove north into the evening. If this story touched something in you, if you thought of somebody in your own life you have been meaning to call, or somebody you have been meaning to forgive, or somebody you have been meaning to help, leave a little heart in the comments and tell me about it. Give this video a like if you believe that it is never too late for a person to change, and subscribe to the channel so we can share more stories like this one together. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. It means the world.